Well, it's kind of a gray Pacific Northwest day, even though I'm 1,700 miles away from the Pacific Northwest. And I thought it's time to get back with Tales from the 70s. This is 1972. This will be the second episode. And where I left off was I'd made it finally to Seattle, Washington. And the next morning I was due to meet up with the Northwest Outward Bound School's course in the North Cascades. So I took the bus downtown, went down to the Olympic Hotel, and met down there in the parking garage. And there was a guy down there when I got there, and had mountaineering boots and rag wool socks, that's kind of the thing back then. As it turned out, he was the director of the school, and his name was Bill Bird. And I was to find out about 2 years ago that Bill Bird, before he came to Northwest Outward Bound School, Sergeant Shriver in the Kennedy administration had tagged him to run the training center for a new organization called the Peace Corps. So he ran the training in Puerto Rico for the Peace Corps before coming to the Pacific Northwest. So we got on the bus, headed out to the mountains. Bus broke down, they had to wait for another bus, and we finally got to Sulphur Creek Campground at the end of the Seattle Road. And we got there, and they had all this gear and stuff, and they started issuing gear. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is the gear, what they gave us. And they gave us one of the things back then is they had the ice axes only had wooden shafts, and so they were all wooden shaft ice axes, and these ice axes all had electrical tape on them. So I went through them, and yeah, there were still some cracks in them and stuff, and that's why they were taped up. So got one of those. We got an Army canteen cup. We got one of those Army ponchos, and back then those were the kind of rubberized fabric one. They weren't the ripstop coated ripstop nylon thing, so they were kind of heavy. And then they had the food for the course boxed up for 10 people for 10 days. Well, there was only 8 of us, so that was a good and a bad. We had a bunch of extra food, but that was a lot of extra weight. But we packed up all 10 days food for 10 people, and we were given pads, mats, you want to call them. They were, I think what they did is they got these from firefighter, from the Forest Service or something, but they were this very thin closed cell foam. And nowadays it's the kind of stuff that if you buy a piece of electronic equipment and you open it up, that's what's around as padding and cushioning and that. So they weren't just really great things. And back then what we would do is we would get all of our water out of the lakes and streams, and we didn't have filters back then. So for 24 days we would drink directly out of the rivers and lakes and streams and stuff, which is really quite something to look back onto. We were given big plastic sheets like you would have if you were painting a house or something, just the opaque plastic sheeting. And those were our tarps, our tents, and that's what we slept under. And we cooked on fires almost every night. We did have one little stove, butane stove, that we carried with us, just one, and we had that. And but we would camp and we'd have to rig our tarp and build a fire and cook our meals, and that's how we did for 24 days. So Navy's using my airspace for training today, so I just have to deal with those guys. But anyway, we took off the next morning. It had rained that night, and up to that point I hadn't seen any mountains whatsoever. So we took off. We entered into the Glacier Peak Wilderness, went along the hiking trail along the Seattle River, and we made it to Miners Creek, which is pretty good hike. And the last thing before we got there is we had to cross Miners Creek. Well, it was flowing pretty darn good, and the only way to get across it was a big down log, and that was kind of at the end of a long hike day with heavy packs and everything. That was quite something to get over that. And so anyway, we made camp. The instructor took our spoons away from us, and took our spoons away from us for the night. They would give them back to us after breakfast the next day. Next morning we got up, had to build a fire. Of course, it was all foggy and misty, Pacific Northwest kind of a day. And so we had been on the trail the day before, and it was kind of like today here. It was all overcast and foggy. And we came up around a bend on the trail, and all of a sudden the sky just opened up, clear blue skies, and there was Glacier Peak. I'd never seen such a glaciated peak. It has glaciers, as the name would imply, all over it, and that was the first we'd seen of the mountain. So anyway, the next day after we built our fires, and we took off up Miners Creek, and again we had to cross back over it. And this time there was a log laying over the creek, but it was on the center of it. The water was flowing over. Well, one of the guys just took off over that. He just stepped into where the water was flowing over. His legs went out from under him. Down he went, and he caught himself like this. So he was on that log like this with the water coming down over him, and we were all just kind of like, what are we going to do? And finally before we could do anything, he got out, and we strung a rope and went across. And that was a ridge that we had to climb once we got across onto the other side, and we saw that there was a trail. But when we went over there, you could see there's an avalanche chute where an avalanche had come down, mowed all the trees down and everything. And so there were down trees, shrubs, all stuff. So we bushwhacked all the way up, probably 500-600 feet anyway, and to meet the trail. And we got up there, and we look over, and here comes the instructor down the trail. And if we had gone maybe another 100 feet down the trail, we would have seen that avalanche had not wiped out the trail. We could have gone up a trail, but we had gone over all those down logs and stuff. It wasn't too good at all. So we got to a spot called Glacier Peak Mines. It was an old mining claim. It was cleared out area, kind of a flat area, and that's where we made camp. And it was a spectacular view overlooking. There was Glacier Peak. There were other, the Cascades stretching across the horizon. Just a spectacular place. And that's where we spent the night. Next morning, we get up, and the instructor shows us, we get our gold line climbing ropes. That was another thing from back in that day. Gold line, it was a climbing rope that people used back in those days. And so we got that and learned how to do some knots and stuff. And then we took off, and over off the ridge there's this big bowl, and it went up to Plumber Peak. And so we went over there and we climbed Plumber Peak, learning how to use the ice axe going up, learning how to kick steps, turn around, started back down, did plunge steps, all basic mountaineering skills. So, but before we went back to camp, we kind of contoured over, and there's this huge slope. And all that was covered in deep snow, because the winter of 71, 72 had been a record snowfall year in the Cascades, and that record held for a number of years. And that was a lot of snow still on the ground, and we would be crossing and walking and traversing all kinds of snow slopes for the 24 days that we were there. So anyway, we went over there, and he was going to show us how to self-arrest. And so that's what we did. And of course, we just sat down and slid down, rolled and did the self-arrest. But the last thing we did was to stand there on the slope with our backs to the slope. So the slope was behind us, the instructor was in front of us, and he'd place his hand on our chest. And he would stand there, and wham, before we knew it, he would just push us as hard as he could we would fly backwards. We would fly through the air and drop onto that slope and land on our back, going now at high speed head first down, and we'd have to self-arrest. So we practiced those skills so that we got pretty darn good at them. So we moved. The instructors took off. We went over to the camp that night, and then we headed for Cloudy Pass. And we got to Cloudy Pass and met up with the assistant instructors, and went along the ridge over to North Star Peak and climbed North Star Peak. Came back, and there was a big bare rock area, and that's where we made camp for the night. We camped there for the night. And this is one of the first rather strange, or I don't know how to describe it, occurrences on this trip. And the next morning, fast asleep, and I hear this loud music, and it was loud, and it woke me up. And I go, who in the heck has a radio? Because that'd be the only, we didn't have MP3, MP4 players back then. We didn't have any of that stuff, Walkmans, nothing. The only thing it could have been is a radio. And I came awake, and the song I had heard was a Beatles song called Dear Prudence, Dear Prudence. And that was the song I heard, clear as this clear. And I woke up and went, who the heck is that? And I looked around, and everybody was asleep. It was stone cold silence. And I looked off, and just as I looked off, the sun peeked up over the ridge of mountains back there in the background, and I just couldn't believe it, Anyway, that was a kind of an odd thing, and have no explanation for it. We took off. We went down from there down past Lyman Lake onto Heart Lake, and camped there for the night. And we did a little bit of trail maintenance. We went across over there. Now we're in the drainage of Railroad Creek, and we went across to some cliffs and did some rappelling. And then we finally went the next morning. We got up at 5, and it was still dark, and we took off on a run. And we ran up the trail for a while, turned around and came back, and we ran back down the trail. And when we got to the lake, we just jumped into the lake. Now, this lake was being fed by glacier melt, which was up at Lyman Lake, just a couple of miles upstream. So the water was icy cold, but it was really something. So we ended up getting across Railroad Creek, and we strung a rope across called a Tyrolean Traverse to get us in the gear. And we got that done. And now we're on Big Creek. And we spent 2 days bushwhacking through the alder thickets up Big Creek. Finally got over the divide there. And there was no trail, it was just, we found our way, and we dropped over that divide and ended up in Spider Meadow. And the rumbles of a storm were in the distance, and the lightning was popping, so we headed quickly down the trail. And we had extreme, after the bushwhacking and climbing over the divide and getting down there, we had a very long day, and it was probably near dusk, near sunset, when we finally got down to the road and the campground. And we had been in the Glacier Peak Wilderness at that point for 10 days. So we were about halfway through, and we met up, and that was resupply. So we'd get another 10 days worth of food. We'd have a day of rest. And so we were getting ready to continue on for the next half of this excursion into the Glacier Peak Wilderness.